الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا فإنه من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما أما بعد عباد الله فإن أحسن الحديث كتاب الله وأحسن الهدي هدي نبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة. I praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as all forms of praise belong to Him, and I bear witness that there is no true deity worthy of worship except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I bear witness that His messenger Mohamed sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is His final and last messenger. O you who believe, have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do not die except in a state of Islam, in a state of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. O you who believe, have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say the truth. If you do so, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would correct and rectify your actions. And whomever obeys Allah and His messenger, then he has already attained the ultimate success. Dear brothers and sisters in Islam, the best of speech is the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran. And the best of guidance is the guidance of His messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And the worst of matters are newly innovated matters in this religion, because whatever is newly innovated in this religion will lead you astray. Before we start, inshallah, I'd like to remind our brothers and sisters that the khutbah is part of the Jumu'ah, and it is a ibad, an act of worship, like salah. And similar how you don't hold your phones in salah, you don't hold your phones in the khutbah. And similar how you don't speak in salah to your neighbors and say salam and have a conversation, you also don't do that in the khutbah. As the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned, whomever fiddles with pebbles in front of him, then he has lost the reward. Right? Just fiddling with pebbles, even if they're silent, that they lost the reward of the Jum'ah. Doesn't mean they have not fulfilled the obligation, but the reward has been gone. And so it's a reminder, inshallah, for everyone to please take a few moments, put your phone down, put it in your pocket. And subhanAllah, even when I'm asking the people to do that, brothers and sisters do that, brothers and sisters still continue to hold their phones. So, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the sake of your act of worship, put them away. It's only a few minutes of your day dedicated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nafi' ibn Umar, Nafi' Mawla Abdullah ibn Umar. So Nafi' was the freed slave, the servant of Abdullah ibn Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. So Nafi' radiallahu anhu, who was also one of the biggest students of Abdullah ibn Umar. And he actually narrated many of the hadith, and Imam Malik narrates from Nafi'. He said that me, talking about himself and Abdullah ibn Umar, and a few of his friends, one day went out on an outing. And when they went out to the outskirts of Medina, so they were living in Medina, they went to the outskirts of Medina, and then they spread a sufra, which is just a fabric or something that you spread on the ground to eat food. As they were doing that, a shepherd had passed by. And Abdullah ibn Umar, radiallahu anhu, he asked him, he said, "Come, eat with us." And so the shepherd said, "I'm fasting." Now, one description about this shepherd is that he was actually a young individual. He was not an old individual, he was a young individual, meaning a child closer to teenager years. And he said, "I am fasting." And it happened to be an extremely hot day that day. And so Abdullah ibn Umar said, subhanAllah, in this hot day, shepherding those sheep that you have in this valley, in this heat, you're fasting. And so the child or the teenager or the young individual, he answered, he said, "Yes, I'm occupying my time. I'm occupying my time." And so Abdullah ibn Umar then looked at him and he asked him, he said, "Do you have any sort of sheep that you can sell us so that we would slaughter it and cook it, and you would eat from it, have your iftar from it, and we would give you its price?" And so he responded, that young individual, he said, those do not belong to me, they belong to my master. And Abdullah ibn Umar said, well, what would your master say if you just tell him the wolf ate one? He wouldn't know, because the shepherd is somebody that is entrusted, and if you tell the master that something ate it, khalas. The young individual just walked away, and all he repeated was, and where is Allah? Where is Allah? And so Abdullah ibn Umar, on the way back the entire day, he would just say, where is Allah? Where is Allah? And when he went to Medina, he sought out that shepherd, and it turned out that he was a slave to somebody else. He bought him, and he bought that flock of sheep, and he freed the boy, and he gave him that flock of sheep. What I want to point out to the story is the level of honesty and trustworthiness that this young individual had. Now, I want you to think of their circumstances. This is an individual that most likely could use the money. And if he had taken it, nobody would have found out about it. His master would not have known. Because all he could have said was that the wolf ate it. It's not like he lost a lot of it. He just lost one sheep. And so there was a situation where that individual had reasons to take advantage of the offer that was given him. Something that would benefit them personally in a materialistic way, and they would get away with it. But what is it that made this individual say no and rather fulfill their trust? Now, of course, we're talking about an environment that this was the time of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. The time where dominantly the level of honesty and trust was a lot more than distrust and dishonesty. And people were more likely to fulfill their trust as opposed to betray that trust. That was the norm. It doesn't mean that there isn't the few rotten apples that existed among the community that would lie and cheat and betray the people's trust. They existed, but the dominant feature was not like that. Because overall, they still remember the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, O you who believe, fulfill your trust. Right? Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, fulfill your trust. Inna Allah ya'murukum an tu'addu al-amanati ila ahliha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders you to fulfill the trust to those who have entrusted you, who it belongs to. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also said, and they remember this, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, la takhunu Allah wa rasula, wa la takhunu amanatikum wa antum ta'lamun. O you who believe, do not betray Allah and His Messenger, and do not betray your trust when you know, referring to when you know the consequences of betraying that trust. And so this was something that was fresh in their memories, and they understood it. And it was prevalent among them. And they understood it was an act of worship because it's an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it also had a reward. In a hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, "Admanu li min anfusikum sittan, admanu lakum al-jannah." Guarantee to me from yourself 6 things, and I will guarantee you Jannah. And one of those things mentioned, one of the 6 things mentioned in that hadith is to fulfill the trust. If you're entrusted with something, fulfill it. Now I have to say, these hadith, when they talk about trust, it is the most general terms. Most people think when you're entrusted with something is when somebody gives you something that you give it back or you protect it. It is more than that. It goes beyond that. Because each one of us, whether we realize it or not, we're in a position that we're entrusted with something. Whether it's a position in a job. Whenever you're hired to do something, you're entrusted to fulfill that job. If you're a parent, your children are entrusted to you. If you're a spouse, both the rights of other spouse of your husband, your wife entrusts you with certain things, and Allah entrusts you to fulfill those obligations towards your wife, and vice versa, the wife to the husband. Whenever you're in charge of anything, that is a position of trust. Just in the broader sense. Now, if we look and move this idea to the current time that we live in, what do we see? We're going to notice that there in reality is an erosion of that trust. That what's expected nowadays is that people would lie and cheat and betray a trust. And that's a problem. That's a huge issue. Because the default setting now, people are surprised when others fulfill what they promise to do, or deliver, or what they're entrusted with. And this is not how it should be. And I'm not talking, my concern is of course the entire ummah, but I'm not talking just specifically about everybody else, but I'm talking about the Muslims themselves. Us as an ummah, the followers of the Prophet ﷺ, that quality in reality, unfortunately, we have to face it, dissolved. Or is dissolving to the point that it's almost there seldomly. And we have to be careful of this. And yes, by the way, this is something that the Prophet ﷺ predicted to happen, but it's never an excuse. In a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, أَوَّلَ مَا يُرْفَعُ مِنَ النَّاسِ الْأَمَانَةِ. That's in one narration. He said the first thing that would be elevated from the people is trust. In another hadith, إِنَّ أَوَّلَ مَا يُرْفَعُ مِنْ دِينِكُمْ أو أول ما تفقدون من دينكم الأمانة. That the first thing that you would lose from your dinikum, from your deen, is amana. Which tells us that amana is part of this deen. And if it's gone, then we lose part of our deen. This is why this is something that is important. This is why this is something that is significant, and we have to pay attention to it. Now the question is, why is it that we have come to the state? Now once again, we're thinking as Muslims over here. What is it that brought us to the state? And we should know this, or try to find this out, because the only way we're going to be able to solve a problem is we know what the problem is, or what led to that problem. So you can mend it and fix it. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because a lot of the problems we have in society are directly linked with this amana. A lot of the issues that we have among ourselves directly associate with this. At every level, by the way. And this loss of trust affects us in every aspect of our life. And we see it. Those who betray the trust, for example, as whether they're teachers or workers or celebrities, you name it. And so it affects our children, ourselves, our grandparents, our neighbors, our society. Whether we experience it in the form of a scheme or a theft or betrayal or abuse. We have all experienced this one way or another, which tells you how prevalent it is. So how did we get to this position? Now, of course, there are many things we can look at, but because we only have a few moments, I'm going to mention perhaps maybe 4 things that perhaps are part of what led to us as Muslims as a whole not be able to, but ignore fulfilling that trust, or not desiring perhaps to fulfill that trust. The first reason is that we lost focus of what is important. We lost focus of the hereafter. We lost focus of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To the point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the hereafter becomes an afterthought after we performed an action. Usually when we perform an action as Muslims, we need to stop and ask, will this please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Will this help me enter Jannah, or will it move me away from Jannah? And then we act accordingly. But what we see nowadays is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the hereafter is more of an afterthought. That's if it comes in the first place. Sometimes a person will be doing things for years, and after years they would ask, is this good or bad? Now, alhamdulillah, that they asked. But they could have saved themselves a lot of trouble, a lot of headache, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain, and a lot of sins if this would have done initially. And part of the problem is we lost focus of what is important. We lost focus of our objective, and it's Allah and the hereafter. Because when we lose that focus, we turn our focus to something else, which is more of everything in this world. Our focus becomes, what can we do to help ourselves, to gain, to benefit ourselves only, for worldly gains and not the hereafter. And when this happens, then dispute occurs between one another. And we start fighting and lying and cheating to acquire what we want. That's one of the reasons. The other reason seems to be, the second one, is that a separation happened between Islam and our daily lives. And that is a byproduct of a secular environment that we live in. But the reality is that thought process even infiltrated our Muslim countries in the East. There seems to be a separation between what Islam is and how we run our daily lives. Now, by the way, a lot of things that I mentioned are connected. You cannot separate them. They're always connected one way or another, even by a thin thread. And so over here, naturally, if our focus is not the hereafter, then naturally what's going to happen is we're going to separate between our religion and our daily lives. We stop implementing the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our daily lives when we deal with business transactions, human interactions, you name it. We tend to confine Allah and religion in masjid and home. The minute we walk outside of a masjid, when we're in a masjid, alhamdulillah, at least so far we have the haya to protect the sanctity of a masjid, the home of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the minute we step outside that door, you'll see something else. And I'm just describing a phenomena, not to blame anyone, believe me. It's more of trying to find what the issue is and describe it as it really is so we can fix it. But when we deny it, how are we going to fix it? The reality is we need to think to ourselves, when I walk outside that masjid, am I the same as I am in the masjid? And if not, why? Is there only Allah in the masjid and not outside? Does Allah only exist in our home and not outside in the street? And we can see this for how we treat others, whether it's in the masjid or outside, or co-workers, or whatever, classmates, you name it. This is the problem. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا ادْخُلُوا فِي السِّلْمِ كَافَّةً وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ. O you who believe, enter Islam wholly and don't follow the footsteps of the shaitan. Because shaitan will try to convince you to apply part and leave part. Oh, this is good, do this now, but the other one might be difficult, do it later. Or ignore it. Or you know what, we live in modern times, it does not apply. That we're not in the society of the companions, radiallahu anhum, so how do we apply this aspect? Those are all excuses from the shaitan that provides you with it. It shouldn't be like that. Now, the third reason perhaps of why we are in the state we are of not being able to fulfill our trust is that we tend to reciprocate how people dealt with us. Sometimes it's a human nature, but it's not the right thing to do. When somebody betrays you, we betray them. When somebody does something, we do it. It's the whole excuse is, Ya Sheikh, everybody's stealing. Ya Sheikh, everybody's taking a cut. Ya Sheikh, it's all excuses that don't justify what we're doing. If I don't do it, somebody else will do it. To at least save yourself the sin and let the other people do it. It's not an excuse, and you hear me say this, it sounds horrible. But it is happening. It is what's happening in some of our minds. And that's a betrayal of trust, and it happens because of that. The last thing I'm going to mention is part of the reason why the trust is being betrayed or not being fulfilled is that sometimes we put people without qualification in a position that they shouldn't be in. And this is something the Prophet ﷺ also said. He said, إِذَا ضُيَّعَتِ الْأَمَانَ فَانْتَظِرُوا السَّاعَةَ. He said, if the trust has been neglected, then wait for the hereafter. And so the companions عنهم asked, Ya Rasulullah, كيف إضاعتها Ya Rasulullah? How is it that it will be neglected? So the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا أُسْنِدَ الْأَمْرُ إِلَى غَيْرِ أَهْلِ. He said, if the responsibility or the trust is given to people that are not fit for it, they're not qualified for it. And if we want to be honest, this has two sides to it. One, the person accepting that position or that responsibility. If they know themselves that they cannot fulfill it, they should not take it. But then the other side, the people who are putting that individual in that position or in that trust, they should do their due diligence and not be deceived by fluff that is being placed regarding that individual, their qualifications and so forth. They have to really know that individual. And there's different ways to do this, but it is from both sides. Because when we put individuals who are not rightfully in that position, we betray the trust ourselves in putting individuals shouldn't be there. But also we're expecting a person who's not qualified to fulfill that trust. That's part of the reason what we see nowadays. And once again, it happens at all levels. It doesn't matter what it is, what institution it is, whatever we're talking about. From the highest position in a country to the lowest position that we see. And that explains some of the modern things that we see. Some of the things that are being waged. Whether it is the news anchors, for example, that betray the trust of delivering what the correct news is. Or all the way to the governments that are not fulfilling the trust that they're responsible for. Or all the way down to the educational institutions. That explains clearly what the position we're in. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive all of us. وَقُولِ قَوْلِ هَذَا وَأَسْتَغْفِرُ اللَّهَ لَكُمْ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا فإنه من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أما بعد. So how can we fix this? What are some of the steps that we can take to perhaps bring that level of fulfilling the trust in our lives first and then extend it to the community members or a community as a whole? Now, because there's an ailment doesn't mean that there is no treatment. No, there is always a treatment, but it's whether we implement it or not. And once again, due to the brevity of time or the shortness of time, I'm going to mention perhaps 3 to 4 things that we can look at that can help us individually fulfill the trust that we're given, and inshallah, hopefully that extends to the rest of the community members. Can I ask the brothers to fill in the gaps? There's some of the brothers standing outside already. So there's a whole lot, I see a lot of gaps in front of us. If you have a phone beside you that belongs to you, please move it. Allow others people to sit in, move forward. The closer you are to the first row, the larger the reward. So if you can ask the brothers to move forward and then maybe shift to the inside. So shift to your right, which is my left. So inside and shift to your right, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. So what are the things that we can do? Well, if we know some of those problems, then we can directly address them. One of the first thing is to remind ourselves that we need to focus on the hereafter. And if the only thing that matters is Allah and the hereafter, you'll notice that our decisions of the way we do things will change. Whether it is in ourselves, for example, the attire that we wear. We're going to ask, is this displease Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Does it displease Him or please Him? Is this something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed me to wear or not? Am I conducting myself the way that Allah wants me or not? If that becomes our focus, then everything else is in the background. And everything else becomes an afterthought. And subhanAllah, that allows us to become the role models of humanity, because then we're implementing what Allah orders in every aspect of our lives. And so just to remind ourselves and to refocus again of what is important, and it's the hereafter in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second thing we can do is that we try to, as much as we can, remind ourselves that this is an act of worship. This is an act of worship. And when we're fulfilling a trust, we're dealing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not necessarily the creation. We're dealing with the Creator. This is why when somebody treats us one way, we don't reciprocate it. We do better. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, أَدِّ الْأَمَانَةَ لِمَنْ أَأْتَمَنَكَ وَلَا تَخُنْ مَنْ خَانَكَ. Deliver the trust to the one who has entrusted you, and do not betray who betrayed you. It's not part of our personality as Muslims. It shouldn't be in our dictionary. That should be removed from our behavior. And so remember, we're dealing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's an act of worship. The third is, which is also important in every aspect in our life, is to actively do things that help increase our iman and purify our hearts. Because once again, a lot of these betrayal of trust that we do, you'll find it's associated with some sort of a disease in the heart, whether it is greed or envy, which makes us do things that are impermissible to gain what will make us feel better or rise above others, perhaps. And we disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when our iman is low. And so actively increasing that iman and purifying our hearts will help us become individuals who are trustworthy. The last thing I'm going to mention is that we need perhaps sometimes to remind ourselves of the virtues of being trustworthy. But I'm going to leave you with this. Think of the effect that would have on a society, even as a form of da'wah to others, if every Muslim in this room, in their field of expertise, they're the most trustworthy individual. That the non-Muslims would point out to the teacher and say, this is the best teacher I've ever met. This Muslim, he's trustworthy. Was they're honest in their job. The plumber, the electrician, when they come in, they're honest with them. They say that this is the best Muslim I've ever met, or electrician, and they are a Muslim. A manager at work who truly cares for whom they employ and they're trustworthy will point at them and say, this is the best manager I had, and he happened to be a Muslim. Soon they're going to realize that the common thread is Islam. And this is a religion that encourages people to become the best versions of themselves. And the only thing that can unite people like that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Can you imagine just the Muslim ummah in our township, for example? If each one of us was trustworthy, how would we be with each other? It will move us to another level that we need to seek out. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to reach that level. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات وارحمنا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم إنا نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى. اللهم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم إنا نسألك العفو والعافية في الدنيا والآخرة. اللهم نسألك العفو والعافية في الدنيا والآخرة. اللهم هدنا لما تحبه وترضاه. اللهم إنا نسألك الفردوس الأعلى وما قرب إليها من قول وعمل، ونعوذ بك من النار وما قرب إليها من قول وعمل. اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين وانصرنا على أعدائك أعداء هذا الدين. اللهم رد كيد أعدائنا في نحورهم ولا ترفع لهم راية، ومزقهم كل ممزق، واجعل كيدهم في نحورهم، واجعل تدميرهم في تدبيرهم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين وأعز إخواننا المستضعفين في كل مكان. اللهم أعن إخواننا المستضعفين في غزة وفي فلسطين وفي الصومال وفي السودان وفي جميع بلاد المسلمين يا أرحم الراحمين، إنك على كل شيء قدير. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى اللهم وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. وقوموا إلى صلاتكم يرحمكم الله.